Hello, welcome everyone. I hope you are doing well, all doing well. My name is Neslihan Yakal and I am the Secretary General of TEİD, Ethics and Reputation Society. I saw many unfamiliar names in the registration list, but during the event you will be hearing some information about TEİD, so in order to manage the time, I won't give detailed information about our society. But please do not hesitate to contact me, our team, for further details later. Today we will hear the current global integrity challenges, rising corruption risk, especially during these COVID-19 days, and how strong ethics and compliance programs could support us, companies, to survive these days. Before handing over the screen, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Frank Brown. Frank is the director of the Anti-Corruption Governance Center of Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. He has been working on a diverse portfolio that includes the development and implementation of programs related to governance and anti-corruption. And on top, he is a certified compliance and ethics professional. And Ertugrul Onur is the chairperson of the board of TEİD, who will kindly moderate our event today. One operational information: during our event, you will be all muted and you will be able to post your questions and comments by using Q&A section. We will try our best to address your questions to our speakers as much as our time allows us. So I stop here, and thanking everyone who joined us today, I hand over the screen to Ertuğrul Onur. Başkanım, stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to first thank to you as the General Secretary of TEİD, our fabulous Secretariat team for organizing this event. Frank Bowman, as you explained, Director of Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, for his participation and being our distinguished speaker to these sessions, and our audiences for their attendances. Thank you all. Since you've introduced us, I'm gonna go into the topic, and if you don't mind, I would like to introduce, since you skipped that part, TEİD, Ethics and Reputation Society, for the benefit of our audience. TEİD was established in 2010 with the aim of advocating integrity, adoption of highest ethical standards, transparency, and accountability within private sector. We have more than 150 corporate members and relatively low numbers, but very effective volunteered individual members who are really expert of their respective fields. Our corporate members' annual turnover is equal to almost 15% of Turkey's GDP, and they employ more than 250,000 employees. So that's a really good number in terms of becoming a powerhouse in our field. Our main goal was to become a reference center in the areas where we try to make a difference day by day. I believe since our establishment day, we have achieved many of our targets, but we also believe that we shouldn't stop where we are, and we need to keep up building on top of what we have in order to have further progress in reaching a higher level of goals. TEİD involves in many activities. First, we start creating awareness on business ethics, on the compliance programs, each and every part of the compliance programs, collective actions, and everything. We are creating programs and trainings in order to build capacities, both for our members and both for anyone, actually, any organization who wants to make progress on these fields. We have also published many guidances, books, magazines, articles, in order to provide more accurate information to anyone who is interested in those topics. We have also devised some tools for assessments. As you'll see in the coming slide, TEİD is a member of many international organizations. Its aim is to raise awareness on compliance topics, as I said, and the CIPE is one of them. CIPE has always been very supportive of our activities. We have collaborated on establishing the private sector for collective action in 2015. The main purpose of the project was to improve business environment by enabling companies to engage proactively and jointly tackle bribery and corruption by initiating, promoting, and supporting collective action initiatives. We also developed 2 guidelines for this purpose. Those are collective actions as well as the compliance for SMEs. Frank, once more, welcome to TEİD's webinar today. We have been honored to have you here. There are many topics and issues on our minds that we would like to get your views, opinions on almost all of them, if you don't mind. Let me start with a question on the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. Could you please enlighten us about CIPE? What is its mission and vision? Which kind of accomplishments have you achieved so far? Do you focus on the private sector, as the name CIPE suggests, or do you work with the public sector as well?
Ertugrul, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you, Neslihan, as well. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to speak on a TEİD platform, because TEİD throughout the world is an example that CIPE holds up as we work with partners in Asia and Europe and Africa to show what's possible in this space when it comes to promoting compliance and improving the corruption situations in different countries around the world. So I'm very, very grateful to be here, and I'm hopeful that I can be of some assistance in explaining what we do and why we do it. So you asked several questions about the Center for International Private Enterprise. Those are all good questions, and I'll try to explain briefly what our mission is and how our interests and values intersect and overlap with those of TEİD as well. So the Center for International Private Enterprise has been around for 37 years. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're a mid-sized non-governmental organization with about 160 employees, most of them in Washington, but increasingly more and more around the world. And we only work outside the United States. So we don't concern ourselves at all with corruption challenges in the United States, although there are many of them. We only work overseas. And our emphasis when it comes to anti-corruption compliance tends to be on mid-sized companies. And that's because we find that the mid-sized companies, they often lack both the resources and the motivation to put in place anti-corruption compliance programs. There was a study several years ago by a professor at Northwestern University here in the United States that found that mid-sized companies are both most willing to give bribes and most willing to use the judicial system, even if the judicial system is flawed. So mid-sized companies are really a key player in the overall corruption environment when it comes to the private sector. Larger companies, of course, they also have needs, but typically those needs are being met by organizations like TEİD that bring large companies together to work in a collective action manner. You asked if we work mostly with the private sector, and yes, we work almost exclusively with the private sector. It's very rare that we would work directly with a government. That's both for reputational reasons, because governments come and go, and governments, can perform well or perform badly. So we're much more likely to work with an organization like TEİD, which might present to its government a list of reforms that TEİD or another organization would suggest. So we're much more likely to interact with governments indirectly. And the other reason we don't tend to work with governments is that we're a relatively small organization. And so with our resources, we're not going to convince a government to change its behavior or policies. It's highly unlikely. We are affiliated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a huge business association based in the U.S. And which has tremendous power. So often we will align our interests overseas with that of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So, for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, their position on the U.S. law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I'm sure is very dear, or maybe not dear, but well known to the folks on this call. So the U.S. Chamber's support of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is very important. So that's helpful to us overseas when we are making the argument why companies should put in place anti-corruption compliance programs. So I hope that answers your question. And just overall, for the folks on the call, our role is to support your work. So as a compliance officer, I'm assuming most of the people on the call are working in compliance. We are always looking for ways to work with you and to learn from you and to work together to pursue our common values.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much for your kind compliments to TEİD. Those compliments are very valuable for us, and it motivates us actually to do more in order to create a better business world and environment in our operating geographies. You mentioned middle and small scale enterprises, that you've been focusing a lot more on those issues. I think those are very, very important in the compositions of the country's economies. You know, the small and despite people think that gigantic companies or big multinational companies are important in the economies, despite, I believe, middle and small scale enterprises are the real drivers of each country's economies. So in today's world, they're either working as independent provider or becoming a supplier of a bigger system. So if they want to become a part of those supply systems, compliance is becoming more and more important in their way of operating operational systems, I believe. Now that brings me to another topic. If you don't mind, let's dive into anti-bribery, corruption, and inevitably the world of compliance. When we look at this map seen in the slide, this is a corruption perception index prepared by Transparency International for 2019. We see that countries ranked in 4 categories. The light yellow ones are listed, the very bright yellow ones are in 6, as a total of 6 countries listed in the top of the list out of 180 countries, whereas the orange ones constitutes the second biggest part of the list. They have relatively lower compared to the first 6 countries, but still they are in better conditions if they are in the upper part of the orange list, I might say. And we also see red and dark red colored countries. Unfortunately, their listing is not that good. This is about corruption perception. By the way, as TEİD, we included commercial bribery into commercial into corruption terminology after the enactment of the UK Bribery Act in 2010, because it also has impact on the operations of countries who might be subject to UK Bribery Act as well. So if we look at the next slide, we will see the top 20 country lists for 2019. And in that list, when we look at those countries, we see 14 European countries, mostly from northern, western, and central part of the continent, Europe, 5 countries from Asia Pacific region, and only 1 country from Americas. And that alone country is Canada. Surprisingly, it's not the United States. If we move to the other slide, we will see the top 20 countries list for the last 4 years. When we compare those two lists, we don't see too much change. You know, only some countries move a little bit upper or lower level, but the countries in general are the same. I want to share another slide with you, which is going to be on the Human Development Index issued by the UNDP. So this index was based on life expectancy, education, and per capita income. When we look at the categorization of those countries, we see a little bit difference. This is a little bit better compared to the CPI, but it still gives an idea on the same map from another point of view. Now, here comes the question. Why do you think there is so much variance between countries in terms of perception related to the corruption? Is it because of their economies? Is it because of their rule of law situation? Is it because of unfair distribution of resources? Is it because of cultural differences in those countries? Or another reason that might come to your mind?
Thank you for that question. That's a question I think I could spend several hours trying to answer, and I probably wouldn't do very well. So I'll try to give you an answer based on my experience. So yes, of course, in my experience, there are cultural and historical reasons play a strong role in why different countries have different levels of corruption. So, for example, the Scandinavian countries, I think Finland and Sweden, since the 18th century, have had transparency laws in effect. So government activity, government transactions are highly transparent. And that means that the people of Finland and Sweden, for literally hundreds of years, have been able to watch how their government spends its money and what contracts go to what companies. And that has been the foundation for a business environment in Scandinavia that is among the best in the whole world when it comes to corruption. That's just one example. I think to answer your question, I think it's very useful to look at countries that have transitioned successfully from being highly corrupt to being less corrupt, and to look at the role of the private sector. And so I think one of Turkey's neighbors, Georgia, is often held up as a real success story in the world when it comes to fighting corruption. And to be honest, there aren't that many success stories, but there are two in particular coming out of the former Soviet Union. One is Georgia and one is Estonia. And in the case of Georgia, you had a very, very strong leader who came to power, Mikhail Saakashvili, who put in some radical anti-corruption measures. You had a highly educated population. You had a largely homogenous population ethnically. Everybody's Georgian. I mean, there are subsets of Georgians, but they speak one language and they claim one history. And his radical measures enabled the country to change very quickly when it came to the corruption environment. And when it changed, there was a very almost immediate commercial benefit. So if we look at, for example, wine exports from Georgia and tourism, two of the biggest sources of revenue for that country, when the corruption levels went down, those two industries flourished because, for example, if corruption is significantly low enough in Georgia and wine production and wine exports to the European Union require a degree of transparency when it comes to phytosanitary standards, then obviously it's much easier to meet those in a low corruption environment. So Georgia immediately benefited, and there's been some back and forth and backsliding, but overall, Georgia is still a success story when it comes to corruption. Ukraine is another example where we don't know really what's going to happen. There have been successes and failures, and it's a much larger country. Obviously, there's a conflict with Russia, and so it's not so clear what will happen there. But I think you pointed out many of the factors that contribute to corruption, and rule of law is one that we can really point to as indicating whether a country is moving forward or not. So when the people and companies especially don't have confidence in the judicial system, in the judges and prosecutors, then levels of corruption are likely to be quite high. And when you can bribe a prosecutor or a judge for a decision to gain some sort of commercial advantage and you won't be punished, levels of corruption will be quite high. So I think rule of law is probably the single most important element in terms of change and moving forward. We can look to historical and cultural elements, but those aren't, you can't do much with them. They help explain things a little bit, but rule of law is really probably the most useful point. And anti-corruption commissions are incredibly important when you have a highly corrupt country that is trying to move forward and overcome its corruption issues. So if you look to Indonesia, which has an agency called the KPK, the Commission for the Eradication of Corruption, which in my opinion is the second most effective in the world after Hong Kong. So that the institution is absolutely beloved by the people of Indonesia, because the people of Indonesia and business people in Indonesia are frustrated with levels of corruption. So the people's belief in that anti-corruption commission and the rule of law by extension is so high that when there have been efforts to dismantle or weaken the KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission in Indonesia, people will protest and they'll go to the streets and they'll create a human wall in front of the KPK building to protect it from those who would attack it. So that's an example of how important the rule of law is in promoting anti-corruption reform and how companies benefit from it, because obviously companies need security and they need predictability. They need to understand that the rules apply to everybody, that there's a level playing field. So there's a very strong interest on the part of companies, obviously, and I'm sure people on this call know better than I how true that is. So that's a very long answer to your question.
Ertuğrul Bey, we don't hear you. You are muted. You are muted still.
Yes,
okay.
Now I'm here. You're right. I agree with you 100%. I think we cannot single out one or two reasons as the root causes of these perception, which eventually result or maybe born as a result of corruption that may occur in those countries. It brings me actually your explanations to an idea to what to focus. Sometimes there might be a bad case, it might be a company or a country So how should we look at it? Should we just stick on to our perceptions, or should we look at the transition, as you said? If there is intention to improve the organization in a better way, in a highest ethical standards way, as I may define it, I think it will be much better, because our purpose is to make improvement rather than punishing the organizations for what they might have done, or the persons or the people in those organizations might have involved in it. So that really requires a different session to discuss, I believe. So let's go into a little bit compliance work. As compliance professionals, we have been experiencing some difficulties in our respective industries or geographies. What are the obstacles or difficulties that CIPE has experienced in this regard recently, or generally as well?
Thank you. That's a good question. So I think that at this point in time, with the COVID-19 pandemic disrupting life all over the world and disrupting the life of businesses all over the world, that is probably the single most sort of powerful force at work today in compliance. And what I mean by that is that what we are hearing from our partners all over the world, especially in Africa, but in Eurasia too, in some countries like Moldova, what we're hearing is that compliance officers are facing two big challenges. One challenge is that their companies are deciding to look at the sort of the extreme pressure the companies are under regarding cash flow and revenue. They look at that pressure and they decide to put aside the compliance function and relax the rules and look the other way, so that they can win a contract or make a business deal. So there's tremendous pressure on compliance officers from other areas of the company to do that, to look the other way. And I think that's a very, very difficult problem, because it really, in many companies, especially smaller ones, comes down to questions of personal integrity and personalities, and job security and things. It's a very, very high stakes question for compliance officers. The other factor we're seeing is that with the pandemic emergency, you have governments suspending their ordinary rules for procurement, and they're going into emergency regimes where, because they say they need to act quickly, which of course they do, but they're saying it's necessary to do away with existing rules and to award contracts without having sort of due process and considering multiple tenders, and taking all the steps that are necessary to avoid corruption entering into the procurement regimes of different governments. So those are two big challenges that we're seeing in the compliance world right now, if that's helpful.
Sure. Certainly it helps our thoughts. In our TEİD Academy training, we have a training program which we call TEİD Academy to provide more information to ethics professionals. In first day sessions, we discussed these issues. I think the difference between the highest ethical values, standards, and the moral values might be one of the reasons that may create difference when it comes to making decisions, So it is certainly interesting part. Now, let me share another slide with you before moving to the other question. This slide tells us the performance differences of the companies who have high ethical standards in their organizations and the S&P 500 index. So in this slide, we see those group of companies outperform S&P index significantly. I don't think that that's a coincidence, because I'm going to share another slide with you, which we need to look at the graphics. This is the outcome of the study of Ethisphere Institute. Founding partner and the CEO of Ethisphere Institute, Mr. Alex Brigham, made a statement in his speech when he was launching the most ethical words of the company for the year 2011. He said he reviewed 5 years' performance of the most ethical companies of the world and the S&P 500 index. The study was based on the years between 2007 and 2011. He concluded that the most ethical companies of the world's share price appreciated in value by 102%, while the S&P 500 index appreciated only 26% in the same period. This is a huge difference, both on the valuation side of those companies and as a result of this, profit generated by those companies. I believe this certainly advocates the adoption of the highest ethical standards, as well as execution of a well-designed compliance programs in companies. Do you agree that, given the heightened competition between companies in their respective marketplaces, an important selling point is for a company to have a strong ethics and compliance program?
So, yeah, the obvious answer is yes. That, of course, it gives companies a competitive advantage to have in place anti-corruption compliance programs, and ones that are sort of real and robust and well-funded and have a strong degree of independence. And that's true for two reasons. One reason is that those companies tend to be better run. The corporate governance structure is such that it's the company runs more efficiently and is much more sustainable. So that's one reason. And the other reason is that the risk profile goes down. And this is the argument that we use all over the world when we try to encourage mid-sized companies to put in place anti-corruption compliance programs. We say to them that if you want to join a global value chain, and if you're competing against other companies in your country offering similar services at a similar price, that you will get a significant competitive advantage by having a robust and strong anti-corruption compliance program. And that's because the multinational who's sourcing from your country is looking at risk factors and looking at stability factors. And when you can show them you have an anti-corruption compliance program in place, you will be at an advantage over your peers in that sector. And this is the most powerful argument that we use. When we first started working in this field, we would talk about all the sort of punishments that companies would face if they didn't put in place anti-corruption compliance programs. But we found that this just was not effective, because I recall being in Pakistan maybe 4 or 5 years ago and taking this approach and talking about all the large fines and penalties over $1 billion coming out of the United States. And the Pakistani business people, some of them quite large, said to me, "This really, it's interesting, but this has nothing to do with what we experience here in Pakistan. We're not afraid of the U.S. Department of Justice. It just doesn't matter to us." So our message is really about the business advantages, the business argument for putting in place anti-corruption compliance programs. I think the research you showed or that you cited, and the charts you showed, it's very, very interesting, but I wish that we had available a better correlation between the performance of companies and the degree of ethical norms they have in place. There's very little in terms of research to back that up. I think what you showed was interesting. but we have a long way to go to doing more to prove that. There's an effort in one of our strongest anti-corruption compliance countries, Thailand, where we have a partner who's very similar to TEİD in terms of structure. They're actually working with the Thai Stock Exchange to create bundles of stocks, so funds of stocks that are companies with high levels of anti-corruption compliance. And so over time, it'll be interesting to see how those companies perform on the Thai Stock Exchange versus other companies, and to see if investors in Thailand attach a premium to having in place anti-corruption compliance programs. So I'm hopeful that in the coming years we will have sufficient evidence to make this argument very strongly, because as you're indicating, this is the most powerful argument we can make to put in place anti-corruption compliance programs.
Thanks for the explanation. I think again you're right. There's always a question asked to compliance professionals or anyone actually in the organization when you ask them to do something. What's in it for me? Mm-hmm. So we need to demonstrate what the stakeholder will get the best out of investment. So this is also an investment to the organizations, to the institutions. So if rather than just telling them this company was penalized in the States or in France or in Germany, whichever the country is, by X millions or billions of dollars, trying to convince them on the real gains of introducing this culture and programs within their organizations might make compliance professionals' life easier, I believe. And being inspired from what you said from Thailand, most of the companies actually started reporting after the establishment of the UN Global Compact. It's a very coincidence that the UN has the meeting today. Yesterday they started. So after this initiative was launched, some companies and then most of the companies started reporting. And in those reporting procedures, they're being asked what they're doing in terms of compliances. So if they want to get a higher rate in capital markets indexes, they need to have these kind of programs in their organizations. Okay, now let's move on to a different topic. Since the beginning of the year, all people all around the world has been living an unprecedented situation, at least in our lifetimes. So excluding the World War II, worse might have happened in the early centuries, but we're just looking at our lives. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as the headlines of our session suggest, has forced everyone to face different situations and to overcome many hurdles. We can easily say that not just the business world, but everybody found themselves in a survival mode. There is a research published by Ernst & Young under the title of the Ernst & Young Global Report 2020, with the participation of 3,000 people from 33 countries. One of the conclusions of that report states that 90% of the participants believe that COVID-19 pandemic situation constitutes a risk to the ethical way of doing business. Have you come across any such concern that anti-corruption compliance will drop as a priority because companies are struggling to survive and they are desperate to maintain their revenue flow? I know you touched base very briefly in the earlier questions, but now it's time to elaborate more, maybe.
Sure. No, it's an excellent question, and I think it's an issue that the compliance community is only now beginning to come to terms with. And I know that the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics probably the largest organization, professional organization of compliance officers in the world, is beginning to address this. And I think it's a sensitive topic because obviously those companies where the compliance function is being reduced or they're deprioritizing compliance, they're not going to advertise this. They don't want to talk about it. So it's a very tricky issue. I think that just generally based on the information that we're getting from Africa and from Eurasia, the companies that are most vulnerable to this are the mid-sized ones, because the very large multinationals, they typically have the cash reserves, they have the structures in place, and they are very much playing sort of a long game, and they understand when the pandemic ends and when there's when some degree of normalcy returns, that they will be held accountable for their behavior on anti-corruption issues. So that the issue really is with those mid-sized companies that have much smaller compliance departments. Maybe it's one person or half a person, and where the working environment is such that it's very sort of intimate and personal, and the pressure to look the other way and to deprioritize anti-corruption compliance that pressure can be put on somebody in a whole host of sort of informal, in-person ways. So that's what we're seeing. I think it's probably too early to come to any conclusions, but the anecdotal evidence is yes, this is not a good time for anti-corruption compliance generally. Yeah.
I really agree. If anyone interested to have more details, I would definitely recommend them to at least to review these key findings stated in the slide. When you look at the business world, most companies, executives or board members are focused on cybersecurity, the data integrity, or the leak of data, or the hackers' actions. However, the executives or the employees in general have different concerns when it comes to compliance, the code of conduct, or third-party relations. So the numbers of this study actually raises red flags for compliance professionals. We really need to look at different angles with different point of view. COVID-19 has had actually many impact on many different areas, and for sure it has substantial impact on supply chains. Procurement, as we all know, is a vital part of the supply chain. And centralization of procurement in multinational companies and also imposing stricter control is one of critical instruments for preventing bribery and corruption everywhere. Have you noticed any concern that massive monetary outlays and suspension of ordinary procurement rules will result in greater corruption risks relating to both private and public procurement? I know you already said that you're not focused on public side much, but I'm sure you may have some views on it.
Yeah, and you're right that the scale is incredible. So I think the International Monetary Fund, for example, has reported requests from over 100 countries for emergency loans to deal with the pandemic, and that means what we're talking about there is increases in healthcare procurement, and conservative estimates by an expert that we work with often, Alexandra Gillis, shows that the amount of a transaction that goes to corruption in the healthcare area is globally at least 6%, and that's a conservative estimate. Often it's much higher, obviously. So you've got massive amounts of money, billions of dollars flowing out from the IMF to over 100 countries under two mechanisms the IMF has: the Rapid Financing Instrument and the Rapid Credit Facility. And with these massive outlays, that's being combined with a suspension of ordinary procurement rules. We've seen instances of that most publicly in Hungary, in Brazil. We're just launching a program in Ecuador to look at on the municipal level how that's operating when it comes to healthcare procurement. So this is a tremendous issue, and it really falls upon NGOs in these countries to perform the monitoring. Unfortunately, often they don't have the capacity to do that. So typically it's NGOs and journalists who are in the lead at monitoring how this money is being spent, and what it's doing to global value chains when it comes to corruption levels. But you're right, it's a huge issue.
I really see. One may think that the healthcare industry, as you very clearly mentioned, defense, oil and gas, alcoholic or tobacco industries might be exposed more to those risks. However, COVID-19 brought other industry players to the same risk as well because of the lockdowns in the countries. Some companies in respective industries must continue their production and supply chain operations in order to provide essential goods and services to the people. And in order to do that, they must have official permissions from their government. So even if you're operating in the most liberal industry, in COVID-19 situation actually brings you to interaction with the government officials, in order to get necessary licenses to continue your operations. So I think this era is more risky compared to ordinary way of doing business, prior to the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic situation. Okay, I think we have time for one more question before taking questions from our audiences. I really want to know, both as a member of TEİD and the individual who is really willing to know and understand more of the roles of the and the responsibilities of the compliance officers. So this is going to be related to the compliance officers within the organizations. It's been a never-ending discussion for us in the compliance world, at least at local levels. Maybe it might be different in Western part of the world, but when it comes to this side, it is still under discussion. It is about how compliance departments should be positioned within organizations. What should be the roles and responsibilities of a compliance officer? And what are the accountability frame of compliance officer? And how they're reporting within the organization, etc. We may adapt the required resources. Now, Mr. Richard Casson of the FCPA blog published an article in the FCPA blog on this topic recently on September 10. He explained that the chief compliance officer's role transformed from part-time generalist to today's highly specialized super executives. So this is a very bold statement. He also added that the SEC enforcement chief, Mr. Andrew Krasny, went even further than this and put the spotlight on compliance officers. In 2015, he said the SEC would make corporate charging decisions after asking the following questions. Are compliance personnel included in critical meetings? Are their views typically sought and followed? Do compliance officers report to the CEO and have significant visibility with the board? Is the compliance department viewed as an important partner in the business and not simply as a support function or a cost center. Is compliance, given the personnel and resources necessary to fully cover the entity's needs? So these are not my questions, these are his questions. He also added that the SEC also began charging compliance officers themselves, including CCOs, Chief Compliance Officers, who exhibited a wholesale failure to carry out his or her responsibilities. Now, here comes my part. I think these are the issues worth thinking about. What would you think about the roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, and the required skill set, capabilities of compliance officers? Is there any precedent that you know that a chief compliance officer was charged in the US for any reason?
So I don't know. I can't answer that specific question, but I would say that this development that he outlines in the article is probably a very positive one, right? So for compliance officers on the phone, this means you'll be earning more money, right? And you'll have a higher position and you'll have more access to the head of the company. Those are all good things, but with that comes added responsibility and perhaps personal liability. And that's, to your question, Ertugrul, is regarding charging of chief compliance officers. I think what we'll see come out of this will be much better sort of educational support for the profession. So I think because it's such a unique position, because it depends so much on the personal attributes of the person, and having the strength of character to say no when everybody is saying yes. I think you'll start in business schools to see specialized curriculum for training compliance officers in recognition of the unique role. But this is a really interesting issue to watch. The U.S., is in the lead when it comes to enforcement and defining what the role should be. We'll see what the rest of the world does, but it's a significant development that has a very sort of personal implication for folks on the call, I think.
Sure. I agree with you. This is a very positive article, actually, to demonstrate the importance of the compliance and the compliance officer's role. The thing is, it is originated from the FCPA, and all the regulations derivated from after Enron's case in the United States. So the progress in the United States part from regulations law point of view and the expectations from the compliance part is very high. The sophistication level is high. When it comes to other part of the world, when those companies in this geography try to introduce compliance programs, they may still be in the early stages of the US, which was the case in 20 years ago. So if they apply a generalist approach to compliance officer today in their organizations, but involved in a potential violation of, let's say, FCPA or SEC regulations, considering that they're listed in the New York Stock Exchange, on the other hand, they will be held accountable based on those questions set in the US, not in the sophistication level of their respective countries. Am I right or wrong?
Exactly.
I'm not sure. That's why I'm asking this question.
Exactly. I mean, so the U.S. Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, they claim broad jurisdiction all over the world, and the standard for establishing jurisdiction is pretty low. So you're right. In principle, based on the guidance that the Department of Justice is putting out, indicating the importance of compliance officers and their level of responsibility, we could see compliance officers from all over the world being held to this new standard. I think it's probably too early to say, but that seems to be the direction in which the Department of Justice is going. So it'll be very interesting to watch future enforcement actions, future prosecutions, to see what happens in this regard. But it's certainly worth paying attention to. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very much. Before concluding our session, let's go to some questions that we might have received from the audiences. Neslihan Hanım, would you please help us to have some questions if we still have a couple of minutes?
Yes, we have a couple of minutes, only 3 minutes, so maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions. Let me check. One question: how do you think mid-sized company can help their eradication of corruption in and around?
So we offer several services to help mid-sized companies do that. Please feel free to reach out to me. Perhaps somebody could put in the chat function my email address, but I'm happy to send materials that would help mid-sized companies do that. And we may already have a program in your country. We work in over 20 countries, and we'd be happy to support you.
Okay, then one related question actually coming from, as far as I remember, from Babak. With COVID pandemic changing the landscape of supply chains, can this be an incentive for Turkish SMEs to implement strong compliance program and compete for a big slice of global supply chain?
That's a great question. And so Babak is zeroing in on a positive dimension to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is that as you have these international actors moving into different countries to respond to the pandemic, they often have very, very high anti-corruption compliance standards. And so those mid-sized companies who have in place compliance programs will have a significant advantage. So that's good news on the COVID-19 front. So yeah, good point.
Yeah. As TEİD, having this kind of culture in small and mid-scaled enterprises is one of our priorities. We're trying to explain the importance of this aspect to SMEs as well. We want them to become part of TEİD more so that they will be able to get all kind of information, training, instruments from us. We provide most of our events without any fee to public. We also believe that having a proper compliance culture within the organization will be a life-saving strategy for the SMEs for the next decade. So you may still survive with today's realities or flexible way of doing business styles or etc. But it may not be the case. If you want to export from one country to other countries that already enforces high level of compliance in their respective territories. So it's going to be an integral and inseparable part of way of doing business.
I totally agree. Yeah, I think that's true.
Now we are on time, so I would like to ask a few more questions, but I think to be fixed on time, we will stop here. Do you have something to add in mind, Frank?
Okay, then let's hear from Frank.
Oh, so just very quickly to repeat that it's been a real pleasure to speak to everybody today, and to be reminded of the good work that TEİD is doing, and to be reminded of how much we have in common all over the world as we work on this issue, because it really does unify people and companies in improving the overall corruption situation, and it's has never been more important than it is right now.
Well, Frank, I cannot thank you enough for taking out time and being with us today. Us compliance professionals are extremely hungry for any knowledge that will light our way in terms of advocating high ethical standards, best practices, and cases from which we may learn. We highly appreciate your time and contribution to our talks. And I really hope this one, looking forward to seeing you at another event. I believe this one felt so short. Hopefully soon and more than being hopeful in person, in a physical environment, just after the pandemic is over.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to you, Neslihan.
Thank you. Then Frank, Ertuğrul Bey, thank you, and everyone who joined us today. Thank you for being with us. Wherever you are, I wish you to be happy, stay healthy and compliant. Have a great day and evening then. Thank you.